If you've spent any time exploring ancient mysteries online, you've likely encountered a compelling narrative. Ancient Sumerian texts, we're told, describe advanced beings called the Anunnaki who descended from the heavens in spacecraft, genetically engineered humanity to mine gold, and seeded civilization across the ancient world. These extraterrestrial visitors from a mysterious planet called Nibiru supposedly created us as a slave species, gave us knowledge, and then departed, leaving behind only cryptic clues in clay tablets thousands of years old. It's a fascinating story, one that has captured millions of imaginations and spawned countless books, documentaries, and online theories. But here's the problem. When you actually read the Sumerian texts themselves, when you examine what these ancient clay tablets truly say in their original language, the story falls apart completely. The Anunnaki were not ancient astronauts. They were not genetic engineers from another planet. And the texts don't describe anything remotely resembling spacecraft or advanced technology. Today, we're setting the record straight. The modern Anunnaki ancient astronaut theory can be traced primarily to one man, Zecharia Sitchin, an Azerbaijani-born author, who published a series of books beginning in 1976 with The 12th Planet. Sitchin claimed to be able to read Sumerian cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script pressed into clay tablets over 4,000 years ago. He presented himself as someone who had uncovered hidden truths that academic scholars had either missed or were deliberately concealing. His central claims were bold and specific. The Anunnaki, he argued, were extraterrestrial beings from a planet called Nibiru that orbits our sun on a highly elliptical path, returning to the inner solar system every 3,600 years. These aliens came to Earth approximately 450,000 years ago to mine gold, which they needed to repair their planet's deteriorating atmosphere. Finding the mining work too difficult, they genetically engineered Homo sapiens by mixing their own DNA with that of primitive hominids, creating humanity to serve as workers in their gold mines. It's an elaborate narrative that connects ancient mythology with modern science fiction, that promises to explain both human origins and the seemingly advanced knowledge of ancient civilizations. The problem is that virtually none of it is supported by the actual Sumerian texts, and every expert who has devoted their career to studying the Sumerian language and literature has pointed this out repeatedly. Let's start with the most basic issue, the translation of the word Anunnaki itself. Sitchin claimed that Anunnaki means those who from heaven to earth came, suggesting extraterrestrial origin. This translation has been repeated so many times in popular culture that many people accept it as fact. But it's simply wrong. The word Anunnaki is composed of Sumerian elements that actually mean princely seed or offspring of An. An was the sky god, the deity whose name literally means heaven. The Anunnaki were understood as descendants of this primordial deity, members of the divine family, gods of princely blood. Every reputable Sumerian dictionary, every scholarly analysis of Sumerian grammar and etymology confirms this translation. This isn't a matter of interpretation or debate among experts. It's basic linguistic fact. Samuel Noah Kramer, one of the pioneering scholars who devoted his entire career to translating Sumerian texts and making them accessible to the world, identified the Anunnaki as a group of deities associated particularly with the underworld, with judgments of the dead, and with determining fate and destiny. They were chthonic gods, spirits of the earth, the 7 judges who sat in the realm of the dead. This characterization appears consistently across multiple Sumerian texts from different periods and cities. This is a far cry from the gold-seeking aliens from planet Nibiru that Sitchin described. The texts portray the Anunnaki as gods who were born into a cosmos that already existed, who occupied specific roles within an established divine hierarchy, who performed particular functions within the cosmic order rather than creating that order themselves. Speaking of Nibiru, let's address that planet directly. Sitchin claimed that Nibiru was a 12th planet in our solar system, though basic astronomy recognizes only 8 planets, plus dwarf planets like Pluto. He based this claim on his interpretation of Sumerian astronomical texts and cylinder seal images. But the word Nibiru in Sumerian and Akkadian texts doesn't refer to a planet at all in the way Sitchin used it. It's an astronomical term that appears in various contexts, sometimes referring to Jupiter, sometimes to a crossing point in the sky, sometimes used more generally to indicate celestial phenomena. There is absolutely no Sumerian text that describes Nibiru as a home world of the Anunnaki. No description of this planet's orbit, no account of beings traveling from Nibiru to Earth. Sitchin created this connection by cherry-picking phrases from different texts, mistranslating key terms, and imposing modern astronomical concepts onto ancient observational records. Astronomers have also pointed out that a planet with the orbital characteristics Sitchin described, returning to the inner solar system every 3,600 years, would be gravitationally unstable and would have disrupted the orbits of other planets long ago. No such planet exists in our solar system. And if it did, we would have detected it with our modern telescopes and space probes. Let's turn to the Sumerian creation narratives themselves and see what they actually say about human origins. The texts make it abundantly clear that the cosmos existed long before humanity appeared. The primordial goddess, Namu, representing the cosmic ocean, existed before creation itself. From her emerged An, the sky, and Ki, the earth. From their union came Enlil, the air god who separated heaven and earth, creating the space where life could exist. These early gods established the fundamental patterns of existence, the cycles of day and night through the movements of sun and moon, the seasons through the flooding of rivers and movements of stars. The divine pantheon grew through successive generations. Nana, the moon god, Utu, the sun god, Inanna, the goddess of love and war, and many others whose names fill the ancient god lists. The Anunnaki appear relatively late in this divine genealogy, as members of the 3rd or 4th generation, depending on how we count. They were not the first gods by any stretch of the imagination. They were born into a cosmos that already possessed structure and order, occupying a specific niche within an already established divine hierarchy. Now, what about the creation of humanity itself? The text called Enki and Ninmah provides the most detailed Sumerian account of human origins, and it's nothing like Sitchin's genetic engineering narrative. According to this composition, the gods, specifically the lesser or junior gods who occupied lower ranks of the divine hierarchy, were burdened with back-breaking work. They dug canals, piled up silt, crushed clay to make bricks, and they complained bitterly about their toil. Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, proposed a solution. Working with his mother Namu and the birth goddess Ninmah, he fashioned the first humans from clay taken from the top of the Abzu, the cosmic ocean of fresh water beneath the earth. The birth goddesses nipped off portions of this sacred clay, and through a process involving divine spittle and perhaps blood, human beings came into existence. This is creation through divine craft, through the molding of clay and the infusion of divine essence. It's a story about gods as artisans, not geneticists. There are no laboratories, no test tubes, no DNA manipulation. The text uses the language and imagery available to Bronze Age scribes, describing creation in terms they understood: pottery, childbirth, craftwork. Some have pointed to later Babylonian texts like the Atrahasis epic, which mentions mixing clay with the blood of a slain god to create humanity. This has been interpreted by ancient astronaut theorists as evidence of genetic engineering, with the divine blood representing alien DNA. But this completely misunderstands ancient Near Eastern religious symbolism. Blood in these texts represents life force, divine essence, the animating principle that separates living beings from dead matter. It's theological metaphor, not biological instruction. The purpose of humanity's creation in these texts is explicitly stated: to relieve the gods of agricultural and construction labor, to tend the fields and maintain the temples, to provide offerings that sustain the divine realm. Humans were created to serve the gods, certainly, but through farming and worship, not through mining operations. And speaking of mining, where does the gold mining narrative come from? It doesn't appear in any Sumerian text. Sitchin extrapolated it from a few scattered references to precious metals in various contexts, combined with his conviction that the Anunnaki needed gold for technological purposes. But the Sumerian texts that mention gold do so in entirely conventional contexts: tribute to temples, royal treasure, decorative objects, symbols of divine radiance. There is no text describing gods or the Anunnaki mining gold. No reference to using gold to repair a planetary atmosphere. No indication that gold had any special technological significance beyond its beauty and rarity. Let's examine some of the specific evidence that ancient astronaut theorists point to as proof of their claims. Cylinder seals, those small carved stones that Sumerians roll across clay to create impressions, are often cited as depicting spacecraft, astronauts, and planetary systems. One famous seal shows a central circular object surrounded by smaller spheres, which Sitchin claimed represented our solar system, with 12 planets, including Nibiru. But when archaeologists and art historians who specialize in Mesopotamian iconography examine this seal, they see something entirely different. A star, probably representing a deity surrounded by smaller celestial bodies in a conventional astronomical or religious scene. The interpretation as a solar system diagram requires ignoring the actual conventions of Sumerian artistic representation and imposing modern astronomical imagery onto ancient religious art. The same is true for images that supposedly show spacecraft or beings in spacesuits. When you understand the symbolic vocabulary of Sumerian art, when you can read the cuneiform inscriptions that often accompany these images and identify which gods or mythological scenes they depict, the spacecraft interpretation evaporates. What look like rockets to modern eyes are stylized representations of sacred trees, architectural elements, or divine symbols. The Sumerian king list is another piece of evidence frequently cited in support of ancient astronaut theories. This ancient document lists kings who ruled before the Great Flood, with reign lengths that seem impossibly long. The first king, Alulim, supposedly reigned for 28,800 years. His successors ruled for similarly astronomical periods, with the combined reigns of 8 antediluvian kings, totaling 241,200 years. Ancient astronaut theorists point to these numbers as evidence that the early rulers were not human, but were long-lived aliens or alien-human hybrids. But scholars have offered much more plausible explanations for these enormous numbers. They may have been symbolic rather than literal, representing qualities or achievements rather than years. The term translated as year might have represented a different unit of time in the original context, perhaps a month or even a day, which would reduce these reigns to more reasonable lengths when recalculated. Most importantly, these antediluvian rulers were understood by the Sumerians themselves as existing in mythological time, in a fundamentally different temporal framework than historical time. The Sumerian worldview emphasized a sharp distinction between the world before the flood and the world after it, treating them as fundamentally different epochs operating under different cosmic conditions. The extreme lifespans marked these early rulers as exceptional, as fundamentally different from later kings, as belonging to a different order of being. This is mythological thinking in its purest form, using chronology to express theological and cosmological ideas, to trace the gradual movement from the divine to the human, from myth to history. It's exactly the kind of symbolic narrative we find in other ancient cultures, from the biblical patriarchs who lived for centuries to the divine emperors of ancient Japan, whose reigns stretched across impossible time spans. The Great Flood narrative itself has been seized upon as evidence of cataclysmic events caused by Nibiru's approach or by the Anunnaki's departure. But the Sumerian flood story, preserved in texts like the Eridu Genesis, is clearly a mythologized memory of real, catastrophic floods that periodically devastated Mesopotamian cities. The flat plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers were extraordinarily vulnerable to flooding. When both rivers overflowed simultaneously, vast areas could be submerged, turning the landscape into an inland sea. Archaeological excavations have found flood layers at multiple Mesopotamian sites, evidence of real historical disasters that would have seemed world-ending to those who experienced them. The story of Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah who survived the flood by building a boat on the advice of the god Enki, is a theological narrative about divine justice, human piety, and the preservation of life. It's not a historical account of planetary catastrophe caused by an approaching planet. One of the most frustrating aspects of the ancient astronaut interpretation of Sumerian texts is how it fundamentally misunderstands what these texts are and how they function. The Sumerian tablets were not secret records meant to preserve hidden knowledge about extraterrestrial visitors. They were religious texts, hymns to gods, myths explaining cosmic origins, administrative records tracking temple grain supplies, medical prescriptions, mathematical exercises, legal contracts, royal inscriptions celebrating military victories. The Sumerians were not trying to encode messages about ancient astronauts for future generations to discover. They were recording their beliefs about the gods they worshipped, documenting their understanding of how the cosmos worked, preserving the myths and rituals that gave meaning to their lives. When we read these texts through the lens of ancient astronaut theory, we're not discovering hidden truths that scholars have missed. We're imposing modern concerns about extraterrestrial life, space travel, and advanced technology onto documents that had entirely different purposes and operated according to entirely different assumptions about reality. It's worth asking why the ancient astronaut interpretation of Sumerian texts has become so popular despite being rejected by every expert in the field. Part of the appeal is that it seems to offer simple answers to complex questions about human origins and the development of civilization. How did ancient people accomplish such impressive feats of architecture and engineering? Aliens helped them. How did civilization develop so rapidly? Aliens brought the knowledge. How did humans evolve so quickly from primitive hominids? Aliens engineered us. These explanations are seductive because They bypass the hard work of understanding ancient cultures on their own terms, of appreciating the ingenuity and capability of our ancestors, of grappling with the actual evidence for how civilizations developed. The ancient astronaut narrative also taps into a kind of modern mythology, our cultural fascination with space exploration, our hopes and fears about extraterrestrial contact, our desire to see ourselves as special, as products of cosmic intervention rather than natural evolution. It flatters us by suggesting that human achievement required alien help while simultaneously diminishing the actual accomplishments of ancient peoples. But when we actually examine the evidence, when we learn to read Sumerian texts in their original language, when we study the archaeological record with care and attention to context, the ancient astronaut theory falls apart completely. The Sumerian texts don't describe spacecraft or genetic engineering. They describe gods who represent natural forces and cosmic principles. They tell stories about creation through divine craft, about the separation of heaven and earth, about floods and droughts and the cycles of the seasons. The Anunnaki were not ancient astronauts from planet Nibiru. They were chthonic deities, judges of the dead, members of the Sumerian divine family. They didn't mine gold or create humanity through genetic manipulation. These are modern inventions imposed onto ancient texts through mistranslation, selective reading, and a fundamental misunderstanding of what these texts actually are. It doesn't mean the Sumerian texts are any less fascinating or important. If anything, understanding what they truly say makes them more remarkable. These clay tablets represent humanity's first attempts to grapple with fundamental questions about existence, to create order out of chaos, to explain where we came from and why we're here. The Sumerians invented writing, developed complex mathematics, created sophisticated legal codes, built magnificent cities, and produced literature that still moves us thousands of years later. They did all of this not with alien help, but through human ingenuity, determination, and creativity. They looked at the world around them, the floods that brought both fertility and destruction, the sun and moon that marked the passage of time, the stars that wheeled overhead in eternal patterns, and they created mythologies to make sense of it all. Their gods were not extraterrestrials, but personifications of the forces that shaped their lives. Enlil was the storm that could destroy cities or bring life-giving rain. Enki was the fresh water that made agriculture possible. Inanna was the fierce love that created life and the violent warfare that destroyed it. These deities represented the Sumerian understanding of a cosmos filled with powerful forces that humans could propitiate through ritual and prayer, but could never fully control. The real story told in Sumerian texts is more profound than any tale of ancient astronauts. It's the story of how human beings first learned to write, to record their thoughts and beliefs for future generations. It's the story of how civilization emerged from the collaboration of thousands of people working together to build cities, dig canals, plant fields, and create surplus wealth that could support specialists like scribes and priests and artisans. It's the story of how humans have always looked up at the stars and wondered about their place in the cosmos, how we've always created narratives to explain our origins and our purpose, how we've always been capable of remarkable achievements when we work together. The Sumerian texts don't need to describe ancient astronauts to be important. They don't need to hide secret messages about extraterrestrial visitors to be valuable. They are important and valuable because they represent the dawn of recorded human thought, the first chapters in the long story of civilization, the earliest voices still speaking to us across 4,000 years. When we respect these texts for what they actually are, when we take the time to understand them in their proper context, when we appreciate the real ingenuity of the people who created them, we honor both the ancient Sumerians and the truth itself. The Anunnaki were gods, not aliens. The texts are religious literature, not secret ET transmissions. And humanity's achievements are our own, built through generations of hard work, creativity, and determination. That's the truth the Sumerian tablets reveal when we actually learn to read them. And it's a truth far more empowering than any tale of ancient astronauts could ever be.